In the past several decades, Nietzsche's gradually become a more admired, or at least a more tolerated figure in the analytic philosophical world. This is to a large degree the result of careful reconstruction, presenting in a clear way Nietzsche's presumptive views on a range of important philosophical questions. Work of this kind has shed helpful light on Nietzsche and the often bracingly heterodox positions that he takes up. To certain readers of Nietzsche, particularly ones who have this more analytical agenda, his unusual manner of presentation can seem sometimes to be an evocative and entertaining, but philosophically dispensable addition. There's a temptation to regret that Nietzsche didn't make enough arguments, and to think if only we could carve off this seemingly incautious and quote-unquote unphilosophical way of proceeding, we'd really be making progress. Literature's or rhetoric's loss would be philosophy's gain. But I think it's also worthwhile to pause and think about why he hardly ever proceeds in a sober argumentative fashion, in line with many of his philosophical predecessors. Christopher Janaway's book on the genealogy, recent book, it's exemplary in its astute attention to these kinds of stylistic questions in Nietzsche's work. So too Maud Clark and David Dudrick's recent book on Beyond Good and Evil, though there I'm more skeptical of various aspects of the interpretation, but it still does have this same emphasis on working through why Nietzsche writes as he does. Both studies are a sign of a welcome renewal of focus in analytically oriented Nietzsche scholarship, back to that of Alexander Nehamas's reading several decades ago on the difficult questions surrounding Nietzsche's idiosyncratic approach to philosophy. I say questions because this is less a question than an assortment of more specific questions, focused on the particularities of various aspects of Nietzsche's various books, and their divergence from what is commonly expected of how philosophers are supposed to proceed. For, it should be obvious, when we compare Nietzsche's approach to philosophy with that of many canonical and contemporary philosophers, we see striking divergences, both in the features that it lacks and in the features that it has. I take my starting point in this essay from the charge that one sometimes hears, frequently uttered in a skeptical tone of voice. Why, given Nietzsche's approach, is what he's doing really philosophical? The notable differences in style between Nietzsche's work and the philosophical mainstream, coupled with this range of literary flourishes, no doubt are what give rise to this often dismissive attitude that's inspiring the question. In this paper, I want to reflect on several of the features of his work that can motivate this concern. And maybe it's not a concern shared by many here, but it's one that you do encounter from many philosophers, Nietzsche's rehabilitation in analytic philosophy notwithstanding. To some who are unfriendly to Nietzsche, his philosophy can just seem sloppy, its flashes of insight and literary merits aside. And in some ways, that charge is fair. But I think there's also more justification than's often realized for why it is that he proceeds as he does. This is, of course, a huge topic, something that could stand a book-length treatment or more. But I'd like to just make some preliminary remarks about it. Few, of course, can reproduce the verve, the lightness, and the wit of Nietzsche's writing. But I think we can think in a clear-headed way about why it might be philosophically important that he writes in the way that he does. The theme of the conference is representation, broadly construed. Both directly and indirectly, Nietzsche's work, I'm going to suggest, raises important methodological questions about how the medium of philosophy represents or presents or conveys truths about the world. In addition to getting a better grasp of Nietzsche's own approach, I hope we can get some broader lessons about the interrelation between truth, method, and style in philosophy, as well as some insight into how we might be more expansive and open in thinking about the modalities of philosophy more generally. So now on to the first section, which is an exegesis of this famous line from the second essay of the genealogy, "Only that which has no history can be defined." One of the most familiar tasks for the philosopher is to try to understand a concept by giving necessary and sufficient conditions for its application. This is a philosophical project spanning the more than 2 millennia from Socrates to the heart of analytic philosophy. Socrates asks his interlocutors things such as, what is piety, what is courage, what is justice? And then through dialectic, one tries to work out what the concept in question is. Take, similarly, a question that occupied Socrates and occupies many still today, namely, what is knowledge? Although justified true belief at one point might have seemed intuitively correct, reflection shows that's unlikely to be right. And so we reflect on our concept more, we refine our account of it in light of various intuitions. Or take another example that's spawned a huge literature. What is it for X to be the cause of Y? Some initially attractive solutions turn out not to work. and so one tries for an account that's better able to withstand the potential counterexamples. For Socrates and Plato, and a number of other philosophers following them, this isn't just a kind of game for clever people who are adroit at coming up with or dodging counterexamples. There's also a more exalted epistemic commitment here that's coupled with this project of definition. A successful definition, it's thought, can yield one the requisite full understanding, Plato's term here is episteme, of the concept at issue. In reflecting on some concept, they think, it's not enough just to point to a few central examples of the thing. One needs a certain kind of insight into why the particular thing falls under the general concept, and their form of definition is supposed to deliver that. Nietzsche doesn't take up this familiar approach, and it's worthwhile to ask, why not? As I'm going to suggest, it's not simply impatience with the so-called hard work of philosophy. He has in the background a principled resistance to this method's employment, at least in many cases. There's a methodological danger rooted in what might be called the Platonic fallacy. Socratic fallacy was already taken. This is the fallacy of thinking that we best understand some concept by getting a particular kind of definition of it, specifically by coming to an account of the features that all and only instances of that concept possess. This particular methodology, and the epistemology of concepts that underlies it, neglects the fact that many, if not all concepts, also have highly interesting and important variations throughout the course of human history. Really understanding a concept, Nietzsche will maintain, requires attentiveness to these variable aspects too, not just to the general features, if there are any, that all instances of the concept have in common. Nietzsche articulates this position most clearly in the second essay of the Genealogy, where he discusses, among other things, the practice of punishment in various human communities and the self-understanding of these communities surrounding this practice. Although there may be a few, in his words, enduring features of things that might correctly be put under the heading of punishment, focusing just on these won't really get us a very informative grasp of the concept. What's needed in addition to these enduring features is, among other things, the self-understanding or meaning of those features, and those meanings are different in particular historical communities. They're not something common across all instances of punishment. Punishment is the sort of thing that, as Nietzsche says, has, quote, not one meaning, but a whole synthesis of meanings. He continues, and this is a quotation from the second essay of the Genealogy, section 13. The previous history of punishment in general, the history of its employment for the most various purposes, finally crystallizes into a kind of unity that is hard to disentangle, hard to analyze, and, as must be emphasized especially, is totally impossible to define. Today, it is impossible to say for certain why people are really punished. All concepts in which an entire process is semiotically concentrated elude definition. Only that which has no history is definable. The passage closes with a powerful epigram that encapsulates Nietzsche's resistance to a certain method of seeking to define concepts. Why, though, is punishment impossible to define? After all, one might wonder, can't I just define punishment as sanctions delivered in retribution for a perceived wrongdoing? That or something in the vicinity seems like it might be a pretty good definition. Indeed, Nietzsche himself acknowledges in that very passage I just read that there are enduring features of punishment, so thus seemingly a concession that they're at least necessary and probably sufficient conditions in the offing. But we should be careful not to be too flat-footed here in making sense of what the skepticism is that Nietzsche's advancing. Definition, as Nietzsche's broadly understanding it, isn't just a matter of identifying features that all and only things in the particular class share. Especially in its Platonic heritage, definition is coupled with a corresponding epistemic promise. It's that which is supposed to yield the supreme sort of understanding of the concept at issue. What Nietzsche wants to say is that when it comes to concepts with rich histories, we begin to understand them adequately only by reflecting on these rich histories. Any purported definition of them, if it neglects this history, will result in an inadequate or incomplete understanding of them, and thus, on the broader and more exalted understanding of definition, actually be an inadequate or incomplete definition of them, regardless of whether it's able to pick out necessary and sufficient conditions. As Nietzsche indicates here, defining a concept such as punishment in a fully adequate fashion is downright impossible. Its history is just too messy and complicated. Punishment has served a multifarious mix of functions throughout human history, and its meanings have been equally diverse. When we think about punishment today, we might be drawn to thinking of it as a calculated matter of rehabilitation or as a matter of deterrence. Yet, as Nietzsche wants to stress, this is naive, not just about the history of punishment, but also naive at a certain psychological level about why it is we still punish today. One of the many historical aspects that Nietzsche emphasizes, no doubt partly to shock our delicate sensibilities, is the entertainment value of punishment throughout much of human history. Not all that long ago, punishment was much more widely and unself-consciously embraced as, in his word, festive. One could bring a picnic and cheer as the unfortunate person got guillotined, or one could bring some rotten eggs to throw at the miscreant in the stocks. We no longer do anything quite like this, but we also do a disservice to the understanding of the intricacies of punishment when we neglect its rather embarrassingly cruel history. Our account, our definition, as it were, will have a serious lacuna. Moreover, we run the danger of being too optimistic in the assessment of our own motives. The announced purpose of the modern prison may be deterrence and rehabilitation, but as that great Nietzschean Michel Foucault would no doubt be at pains to emphasize, we don't understand much of what goes on there without realizing that the impulse to inflict cruelty remains such an ingrained part of the human psyche. Nietzsche's methodological skepticism, in short, centers around whether what is taken to be the mark of an adequate definition actually amounts to one. For by his lights, this drive for universality and generality in definitions is a method that excludes too much of what's actually relevant in coming to understand a concept. This, I think, is part of what Nietzsche is getting at in his most famous passage about perspectivism from the third essay of the genealogy. Although his perspectivism has often been treated as a semantic thesis, a thesis about truth, I think ultimately an incoherent one, the idea being there's no truth, only particular perspectives, and none has any kind of privileged claim to legitimacy. I don't think he actually wants to carry his skepticism that far to that kind of semantic thesis in his mature published work anyway. In this famous passage at issue from the third essay of the genealogy, he writes, "There's only a perspective seeing, only a perspective knowing," in quotation marks. And the more affects we allow to speak about a thing, the more eyes, the different eyes we use to observe a thing, the more complete will our concept, in quotation marks, of this thing, our, quotation marks, objectivity be. There are a few important ideas packed in here, but in the second part of the passage especially, the thought regarding concepts and their comprehension seems to be something like this. We don't understand something better when we extract all of these allegedly extraneous things that people, often under the influence of the affects as much as some allegedly pure rationality, have thought about them. Rather, we need to add these things in order to have a more complete understanding of the concept at issue. The complete concept of a thing, it would thus seem to follow, isn't simply a function of the properties of some supposedly mind-independent object to which that concept refers, some Platonic idea or set or what have you, but of various things that people throughout history have thought about this object. We therefore can arrive at an adequate, or ironically even, an objective account of concepts like punishment or knowledge or anything else without considering what people have thought about them and why they have. Nietzsche thinks it's a mistake to subtract the subjective dimension. In his words, complete objective understanding of any concept will need to include that important subjective dimension too. Consider similarly what Nietzsche says in the following passage from The Gay Science. This is section 58. He says, quote, "This has given me the greatest trouble, and still does, to realize that what things are called is incomparably more important than what they are. The reputation, name, and appearance, the usual measure and weight of a thing, what it counts for, originally almost always wrong and arbitrary, thrown over things like address and altogether foreign to their nature and even to their skin, all this grows from generation unto generation, merely because people believe in it, until it gradually grows to be part of the thing and turns into its very body. What was at first appearance becomes in the end almost invariably the essence and is effective as such." Now here he seems to be drawing a contrast between what people think about X and some fundamental ahistorical truth, if there is one about X. Nietzsche, as I see it, is making 2 points here. First, he's claiming that these truths about how people see things, in his words, what things are called, are more important to philosophical inquiry than any alleged truth about the essence of things, in his words, what they are. But he also gestures at a more ambitious point in the second part of that quotation. What at first was just the appearance, how things look to people, becomes how the things are. There's a kind of, to use a contemporary term, a kind of response dependence here. As enough momentum gets going, and as opinion changes, the constitution of the thing itself, in most cases, he says almost invariably, thereby changes too. At this point, one may press for a distinction. Certain concepts indeed are response dependent. They're social kinds. University professor or symphony would be prime examples. Here, the constitution of the concept is indeed connected with what people think about it. But there are other concepts, and these were the sort that Plato was philosophically interested in, most of all, that track aspects of reality that could be thought to transcend our particular human practices and their history. Nietzsche's position, in the genealogy anyway, is expressly about that which has no history, and his prime example is punishment, a concept bound up with humans and their historically variable practices. In contrast to concepts such as punishment, it may be that certain other concepts have no history in the relevant sense. One might thus think that natural kinds, gold or water, or various important concepts in epistemology and metaphysics, substance or knowledge, have no history in this way. Let us call these, if they're anything that fits this bill, transcendent kinds. To understand punishment, or the psychology of guilt, or the institution of Judeo-Christian morality, one must look to various aspects of human society and history. But not so, it might be argued, with this other range of concepts of transcendent kinds. At minimum, I would hold, though, that Nietzsche was wanting to claim that a great many concepts have an unjustly neglected history. They're actually historically variable social kinds that are misunderstood because inadequate attention has been paid to their history. But I think there's also another key distinction in this vicinity that's worth making, namely one between the concept and the kind to which the concept refers. If we make this distinction, we can allow that the concepts associated with natural kinds have a history. Although the kind doesn't have a history, kind per se doesn't have a history, the concept of that kind does. Concepts on such a view, they're always the product of concept users. So because of this, even concepts associated with transcendent kinds, they have a history. They've arisen at a particular time, changed in particular ways as the result of a diversity of influences. The resultant concept is a patchwork with ragtag edges, not a sharply delineated entity. Because our concepts have such a variegated texture, most of them are incapable of being reconciled without remainder with the kind to which they're supposed to refer. It's a kind of anthropocentric hubris to think that the particular concepts we use could latch on to these transcendent kinds perfectly. So even on the assumption that there's an essence of knowledge or water, it's unlikely, first, that our particular concept perfectly tracks that, and second, that our concept, we should remember also, has a number of interesting, historically variable features that the kind to which it refers doesn't. The skeptical position that I'm setting out here would enable Nietzsche to extend his concern beyond just these social kinds and to talk about the concepts of transcendent kinds too. Now, I don't think the textual evidence is particularly clear about just how far Nietzsche wants to go. But regardless of where precisely we want to slot in his views on these questions, his emphasis, we can certainly say, is much more on the historical, social, and cultural dimension of concepts than on some allegedly independent essence of the concept at issue. The former is something Nietzsche regards as eminently worthy of investigation, the historical, social, and cultural dimension, and something really neglected within the philosophical tradition. His concern with this side of things helps to explain why his approach can seem so unusual against the backdrop of a philosophical tradition much more focused on defining enduring essences. We see a similar orientation at work when it comes to Nietzsche's celebrated investigations into Judeo-Christian morality and its secular descendants. Whereas the task of many moral philosophers is to reflect on our moral intuitions and to systematize them so as to arrive at a set of moral principles, Nietzsche aims instead, in the first instance, at asking much more social and anthropological questions about why we have the moral outlook we do. He's also, of course, interested in evaluative questions about whether it's good for us, but in the first instance, there are social and anthropological questions there as well. Nietzsche ridicules the idea that there might be a, quote, science of morals in the way it has so far been practiced. He writes, it's a quotation from Beyond Good and Evil 186, with a stiff seriousness that inspires laughter, all our philosophers demanded something far more exalted, presumptuous, and solemn from themselves as soon as they approached the study of morality. They wanted to supply a rational foundation for morality. And every philosopher so far has believed that he's provided such a foundation. Morality itself, however, was accepted as given. How remote from their clumsy pride was that task which they considered insignificant and left in dust and must? The task of description, although the subtlest fingers and senses can scarcely be subtle enough for it. For the philosophers who are Nietzsche's target here, there's a certain operative assumption in the background, that our moral system is something that makes sense and can be rationally ordered. It's presupposed in the standard ways of conducting moral philosophy. We describe a case and we elicit intuitions about it. We try to capture those intuitions by means of a general moral principle. We refine that principle in light of various intuitions about particular cases, see if that stands up to scrutiny. The case that's captured the attention of moral philosophy perhaps more than any other is the so-called trolley problem. Certain intuitions pull one in a consequentialist direction, others pull one in a deontological direction. But what if the failure to find a fully satisfactory resolution to these and related cases is the result of the fact that our moral intuitions are resistant to fully rational systematization because they're in deep conflict with one another? If Nietzsche's right about the moral tradition, it's a product of disparate, incompatible strands over its long history. One cannot render perfectly consistent what's fundamentally inconsistent. Now, note as an aside that this recognition needn't point one toward a kind of strong anti-realism or anything of that form, because we don't need to accept the tempting, but I think faulty assumption that all is lost for realism or for thinking that there are truths in ethics if there's not one uniquely correct answer to these difficult moral conundrums. It may be that there are several principles or values, all with genuine normative legitimacy, but still in tension with one another. This lesson of Greek tragedy has made a strangely limited impression on contemporary moral philosophy. Instead of trolleyology or something similar, it's much more in the spirit of a science of morals, Nietzsche would think, to instead describe and explain the history of different strands, and thereby try to account for why intuitions are as they are, rather than trying to arrive at a basically artificial resolution that shaves off the rich complexity of moral life. So far, I've tried to account for why Nietzsche's approach to concepts, moral and otherwise, is different from what we've come to expect of philosophers. It seems to be verging into history, sociology, and anthropology. But as I've so far tried to argue, Nietzsche would claim this is the only way that the most intellectually responsible form of investigation into most, if not all, concepts can be conducted. Concepts for Nietzsche aren't ahistorical transcendent entities, a la the Platonic forms. They're cultural products with a rich, complex history sedimented into them. The traditional project of definition, particularly in the version Nietzsche would have been familiar with from Plato, it would view this historical and cultural dimension as simply an extraneous overlay, distracting us from the fundamental essence of the concept at issue. For Nietzsche, by contrast, the historical and cultural dimension is as philosophically important, if not more so, than any alleged essence of the concept when it comes to understanding it. So now into the second section, where I talk about why it is that Nietzsche always seems to be avoiding making arguments. Nietzsche, time and again, does the very thing we're so often warning undergraduates against, spouting off their opinions without backing them up with an argument. He just seems to tell us what he thinks, typically with a kind of insistent fervor. There's very little in the way of sustained argument in his work. Compared to giants such as Descartes or Spinoza or Kant or even Hegel, Nietzsche, at first glance anyway, isn't a thinker very interested in this. Descartes gives us arguments for why mind and body are separate substances. Spinoza gives quasi-mathematical proofs for a range of things. Kant gives arguments for why space must be understood in absolute rather than relative terms. Hegel gives various reductio arguments to undermine what in his view are inadequate ways of thinking about objects and our relation to them, and so on. Now, of course, it'd be wrong to say we don't get any arguments from Nietzsche. We get some arguments, mainly negative ones, and some strikingly good ones. But I think it's fair to say that argument, at least in its standard varieties, isn't where Nietzsche's energy is focused. As with the avoidance of this Platonic project of definition that I just discussed, this aspect of Nietzsche's approach can foster the suspicion that he's somehow unphilosophical. The thought in the background, and a natural one at that, is that argument of this form is the sine qua non of serious philosophy. We seek to motivate a conclusion by giving a valid argument for it that the force of rationality is going to compel others to accept. The model here is, of course, the deductive argument, and it might be thought no credit to Nietzsche as a philosopher that he engages in it so sparingly. Now, of course, insofar as we're interested in arguments of this kind, rarely are we interested just in their validity. We're interested as much, if not more so, in their soundness. We want to know if they have true premises. Moreover, it can rarely be argument all the way down, almost never. Although we occasionally get sub-arguments for the premises, at some level, we have to reflect on the intuitive plausibility of the argument's premises and just consider whether they strike us as true. That can be as important as the argument itself. Now, I say all of this, which is fairly obvious, just to give us a bit of perspective on how central arguments of this kind really are in philosophy. There can be a tendency to overestimate their necessity. And come to think that if you're not doing this in key places, you're not engaged in an activity that is philosophically respectable. It's not my aim here to try to draw boundary lines between what is proper philosophy and what isn't, but I am trying to offer a partial explanation for why we often get this avoidance of argument in Nietzsche, and to outline some of what we get instead, namely what seems to be a kind of assertion, and to give two of the surely many reasons why this is what we get. Given what Nietzsche wants to accomplish philosophically, I want to suggest, argument of the standard varieties wouldn't be the best way, or even really a possible way, to go about it. The first reason that what we get seems more assertion than argument in Nietzsche's work is that his emphasis is frequently on interpreting something, rather than on giving an argument for a conclusion in a deductive fashion. Nietzsche's focus is less on working out answers to timeless philosophical questions, but on the critical investigation of a range of psychological and cultural phenomena. And of course, he's not alone there. This is something that Hegel also pioneered, at least as one central aspect of his philosophy. Nietzsche seeks to uncover and help us understand the meaning and significance of various human beliefs, behaviors, practices, ideals, institutions, often as a kind of preparation for criticizing them. And this project isn't one that lends itself easily to this style of arguments familiar from elsewhere in philosophy. Accordingly, Nietzsche is most often interested in giving us interpretations. An interpretation, although it's an argument of a sort, is unlike the standard sort of argument, where one proceeds from premises to conclusions. It's basically a practice of sense-making, which will either involve an account of what something means or a fuller characterization of what it is. And often these two sense-making projects shade together. Interpretation is especially familiar from our engagement with the arts. In the process of interpretation, we decide how to make sense of a work of literature, or painting, or a work of music, or a building. We cite aspects of the work in support of our interpretation of it, and it's in light of cohering with these aspects that the interpretation is a good one. Because interpretation is so familiar from our engagement with the arts, and because Nietzsche so often engages in these interpretive endeavors, this can make Nietzsche seem more belletristic than philosophical. But it's important to remember just how pervasive interpretation is across a range of disciplines and throughout human life, especially including ordinary intercourse with others, where we attribute beliefs to them. We try to understand their behavior and so on through interpreting it, often in an immediate and unconscious way. Interpretation is important in a range of academic domains beyond just the arts, too. A medical doctor's faced with a range of symptoms, and she needs to figure out what underlies them. What condition is the patient suffering from? Similarly, there are many other fields where one's faced with evidence, and it's incumbent upon the observer to figure out what it's evidence for. Why are these rocks as they are? What does it signal about the condition of the Earth's core? Or consider also anthropology, where we're trying to make sense of the practices of various groups, and where the sense-making, unlike the two examples just given, needn't be an attempt to seek out a cause for something, which is the most familiar scientific methodology. We ask things like, why do these people bury their dead as they do? What's their religion, and what significance do they attribute to the various deities and rituals within it? So often what Nietzsche's doing, in essence, is the anthropology of the most familiar pillars of Western European culture: Judeo-Christianity, morality, and a range of related phenomena. He maintains a defamiliarizing critical distance that few others manage to have. And this allows him to step back and treat these through the lens of an anthropological observer. Nietzsche's looking to various cultural practices and ideals and interpreting them afresh. This, for him, involves not just explaining causal antecedents, but reflecting on and explicating their meaning. He therefore remarks not just on the causes of guilt or the causes of the rise of democracy and equality or of punishment or the ascetic ideal, but on, as he says, the meaning of these phenomena. This aspect of his work is connected very much with his ambitions as a culture critic. He's critiquing cultures not simply for the bad effects they have on the realization of the perfectionistic goods that he cares about, but also on account of the character of what's expressed in their cultural products, ideals, and institutions. The need to uncover and to reveal this expressive content makes interpretation a central component of his philosophical practice. For a certain time in Nietzsche scholarship and in certain analytic circles, interpretation was under a cloud of suspicion because it was coupled with a particularly strong understanding of perspectivism. The idea, which I think is based largely on a misreading of a passage from the Nachlass, is that an interpretation is something true only from one's particular perspective, with no claim on anyone else's attention if they don't happen to share that perspective. But interpretation needn't be coupled with this strongly skeptical construal of perspectivism. After all, one typically offers an interpretation in the hope of convincing those who don't share one's perspective that they should adjust their views and come to do so. One does this by showing them that one's own interpretation is right, or at least more likely to be right. Interpretation is thus a truth-conducive and truth-seeking activity. Better interpretations are those that succeed in adequately capturing the phenomena in question. Of course, with valid arguments, one's compelled to accept the conclusion if one accepts the premises, and one must accept the validity of the argument, of course, regardless of whether one accepts these premises. Interpretations aren't like this. They don't demand assent in so clear a way. Likewise, it may be the case that there's not a single interpretation that's indisputably correct. It's a sphere where there's more room for plurality. This might be thought to make interpretation much less ironclad than argument, and presumably it's why argument is philosophically preferred. Still, I think there are a range of domains where interpretation is absolutely indispensable. Consider the kind of questions Nietzsche wants to ask. What's the meaning of ascetic ideals? How could you even address that question, apart from just offering an interpretation of what ascetic ideals mean? As Nietzsche indicates, ascetic ideals have meant different things to different people, as an adequate interpretation of them will need to reflect the complexity of this. But the main point is, deductive argument is simply not going to be helpful here. It's not going to get you what you need. Now, we've discussed the role of critical interpretation in Nietzsche's work. I'd like to turn briefly to a second reason Nietzsche avoids argument in its standard varieties and appears to opt for something like assertion instead. Those who prefer argument, they typically want to offer a kind of assurance that the conclusion that they've put forward is right, or at least that it follows logically from their premises. They want someone to be made to accept it by the sheer force of reason. Nietzsche, by contrast, is much more interested in putting promising possibilities on the table, suggesting tantalizing things that might be true. In Beyond Good and Evil, he's explicit about this methodology. He contrasts unfavorably those who prefer a handful of certainty to what he likes more, a whole cartload of beautiful possibilities. He very much is in this latter camp. He thinks it's more philosophically important to suggest provocative and interesting ideas rather than to provide airtight arguments for them, especially when no such arguments are in the offing. At this point, though, one may wish to object. Nietzsche, this criticism goes, doesn't usually follow through on any of these ideas. He just leaves them hanging there without argument, let alone an airtight one. But I think we might note in reply, would it really be better if he argued fully for all these ideas or refrained from putting forward an idea when he didn't have a convincing argument for it? That's part of the overly cautious conventional philosophical methodology that Nietzsche is trying to challenge. If a view is sufficiently interesting, it's often better just to have someone set it out, rather than making this tedious argument that's supposed to convince one beyond any doubt. Again, we needn't jump to the unwarranted conclusion, so tempting for many, that Nietzsche doesn't think there's any truth at all, only his particular perspective on things. The method that I'm outlining is a way of getting at the truth. Simply puts more emphasis on developing possible suggestions, voicing unargued for insights, rather than reaching definitive conclusions, at least conclusions that definitively follow from one's premises. For this reason, Nietzsche puts a considerable emphasis on what he calls attempting and experimenting. He describes in Beyond Good and Evil the new philosopher he admires as paradigmatically this sort of attempter, someone putting forward new ideas and possibilities, but not needing these to be the final word. The etymology of essay in English or the cognate in French, as well as forms of Versuch in German, they're all suggestive of this kind of experimental spirit. Nietzsche is in this sense very much a philosophical essayist rather than an arguer. His methodology is encapsulated well in the form of the aphorism, one of Nietzsche's favorite literary devices. In writing aphoristically, Nietzsche is in a way avoiding argument. He, to a great extent, is just asserting what he perhaps provisionally thinks. But he leaves us with something stimulating and promising to ponder. Then the challenge is ours, to reflect on what he says and determine for ourselves whether it's true, or, as is often the case, whether there's a grain of truth to it. It's worth remembering that we would be doing something similar with argument anyway. Nietzsche just leaves much more of the work to us. Describing his own work in the preface to the genealogy, he says one almost needs to be a cow for his writings. Although Nietzsche is frequently disparaging toward cows and comparing people he loathes to them, here what he says about cows has a more positive twist. The cow ruminates, chews over these ideas. The aphorism presents the idea in a memorable form, and then one chews over it for a while and decides what to make of it. It's often better, according to Nietzsche, to provide the reader with this reflective latitude rather than to come out with an argument. And so now the final and briefest section, which is a bit about hyperbole and the use of imagery. So far I've discussed two aspects of Nietzsche's methodology and tried to explain what philosophical commitments underlie it. Nietzsche doesn't seek to define things in the usual Platonic fashion, and he's far more interested in interpretation and thought-provoking assertion than in deductive argument. He also, as everyone who has read him knows, is prone to use poetic devices with great panache. As with the aspects of his writing described above, this can sometimes encourage the idea that he's a philosophical outsider, somehow more a figure from literature than philosophy. I'd like to briefly focus on two such devices here, hyperbole and metaphorical imagery. There's so much to be said about them. Can't do much in the time allotted here. But what I want to suggest is this. These devices in Nietzsche's hands are not just of rhetorical significance, which is a way that many people have tried to explain them, but they're also of a lethic significance. They're a way of trying to convey insight. So let's start with hyperbole. As will be familiar to just about anyone who's read Nietzsche's work, he has a great tendency to exaggeration. In many cases, it's difficult to know whether he actually believes what he says when, for example, he claims that Zarathustra is the finest gift ever bestowed on mankind. But just let us take as an example of exaggeration what he says at the end of a sparkling passage denouncing Kant and German idealism. This is from The Antichrist, where he, of course, gets very shrill. Why was Kant's appearance greeted with such jubilation among German scholars? The theologian's instinct in the German scholars divined what had once again been made possible. A path had been found on which one could sneak back to the old ideal. The conception of a true world, the conception of morality as the essence of the world, these two most malignant errors of all time, were once again, thanks to a wily and shrewd skepticism, if not provable, at least no longer refutable. Reason, the right of reason, does not extend that far. Reality had been reduced to mere appearance, and a mendaciously fabricated world, the world of being, was honored as reality. Kant's success is merely a theologian's success. Like Luther, like Leibniz, Kant was one more clog for German honesty, which was none too steady in the first place. So, what of this claim that Kant's success, say, is merely a theologian's success? That seems a tremendous exaggeration, understating the seminal contributions Kant made to and influences he had on purely secular philosophical debates. But why does Nietzsche exaggerate in this way? We might be prone to think this is a philosophical failing on his part, going too far rhetorically and saying something pretty clearly false. But as with other aspects of his work that we've discussed, I think there are important reasons, lethic considerations, why he's writing as he does. So, as I said, one way of understanding hyperbole is to think of it in purely rhetorical terms. Nietzsche's using exaggeration to sway his audience, perhaps an audience he thinks needs to be more wary of the bypaths down which Kant is insidiously leading them. Now, his exaggerations, I'm happy to admit, they're often in the service of those kinds of purely rhetorical aims. That's one of the stylistic aspects of his approach that's been written about most, particularly in connection with the genealogy and Beyond Good and Evil. He's trying to shake us, at least some of us anyway, out of our attachment to a particular form of ideology that he doesn't think is good for us. And a cool, dispassionate manner of writing isn't going to do the trick. But if what he's doing is just in the service of shaking us up, then it doesn't seem particularly connected with the truth, except in this indirect way that it makes us more open to eventually acknowledging the truth. I, however, would suggest that there's a more direct connection between exaggeration and truth. For Nietzsche, hyperbole often functions as a way of highlighting. It brings out a truth starkly. So here, the truth, I think a truth, is that Kant's critical project, among its many aims, is also a rearguard action to find some remotely intellectually respectable way of continuing to believe in three implausible things: God, immortality of the soul, and noumenal freedom of the will. Many of us tend to see Kant as a secular Enlightenment figure, but Nietzsche wants to remind us that religious motives were deeply at work as well. As Kant himself acknowledges in the famous line from the preface to the B edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, where he says it's necessary to, quote, deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. So Nietzsche's exaggeration is making that orientation of Kant's very vivid. Take similarly his interpretation of Christianity and morality as insidiously expressive of hatred and ressentiment. Although Nietzsche cites a range of disturbing passages from the Gospels and from Aquinas in support of this, clearly this is a highly one-sided interpretation, and to that degree very exaggerated. Christianity is expressive of a great many things, as Nietzsche in his appreciation of multifariousness should surely want to acknowledge. But the one-sided interpretation helps to bring out an aspect of the Christian worldview better into view. It may not be the whole truth, but it's part of what's going on psychologically. One's reminded of Adorno's paradoxical quip that nothing in psychoanalysis is true except for the exaggerations. Adorno, like Nietzsche, was himself very prone to exaggeration, and part of what's suggested in Adorno's self-referentially exaggerated aphorism is that exaggerations themselves can be an important route to truth. Truth is, of course, more complex than hyperbole can make it seem, but this isn't a problem if one realizes that the interpretation isn't aspiring to be the full truth about the matters at issue. Exaggeration brings out an aspect of a complex phenomena that would not otherwise be clearly in view. Let me turn now very briefly to imagery. It's difficult to treat this phenomenon in general because what we really need to talk about is why Nietzsche uses this particular device in this context, and that would take an extensive study or series of studies. I'd just like to make a broader point in line with what I said about hyperbole, that the alethic significance of, there's an alethic significance to Nietzsche's imagery. With the exception maybe of Plato, few philosophers have such a memorable repertory of imagery that Nietzsche does. Yet Plato, unlike Nietzsche, is self-deprecating about the philosophical status of this imagery. Dialectic is the privileged route to insight. Imagery is basically a way of dumbing things down for less philosophical minds. Well, I don't want to argue that imagery is epistemically superior or that it's indispensable, though it may well be in some cases. I think we should see that it can be truth-disclosing. That is, Nietzsche's imagery isn't just a manner of manipulating the audience's emotions and lessening their attachment to the things Nietzsche's attacking. It's also a matter of drawing their attention to reality and helping them see aspects of it more clearly. The sort of imagery I'm thinking about is what could be put under the broad banner of the metaphorical. It's about, as metaphor so often is, asserting one thing to be something it literally is not, but in the process shedding light on the thing by means of that comparison. In this way, in a way, that's what exaggeration does also, saying something literally false but still illuminating. Of course, there are huge debates, which I can't get into here, about how we're to understand the potentialities of metaphor. And the insights communicated through Nietzsche's imagery, they're hugely varied and resist an easy summary. But let's just do a quick case study here. Animal imagery is deeply important for Nietzsche. Think of how often he compares humans to variegated menagerie, lions, the blonde beast, lambs, sheep, cows, herd animals in general, birds of prey, maggots, spiders, bees, gnats, butterflies, worms, rattlesnakes, turtles, tame house pets, one of my favorites, and some others too. These comparisons function in all different ways, and we need to do a lot to talk about what these different functions are. But they're meant to convey insight about ourselves, our fellow humans, and our world. One of the overarching ideas, of course, with many of these animal comparisons is to remind us that we, too, are basically animals, however much in Nietzsche's phrase, metaphysical bird catchers may pipe to us that we are something higher. We've grown more sophisticated in a range of ways, we are different in key respects, but we're fundamentally still animals. The image of the blonde beast, that infamous and often misunderstood reference to the prowling lion, serves to remind us about these aggressive impulses we harbor within. We've internalized and repressed many of these, in Nietzsche's phrase, rubbing ourselves raw against the bars of our cage. We've become, on the whole, tame house pets, another phrase of his, going from the blonde beast to the declawed ginger cat, who looks at the birds out the window and plays with balls of yarn. Nietzsche's frequent references to the herd suggest a number of competing ideas. The first animal we think of is, of course, the sheep, that notoriously stupid creature who enjoys munching grass and aspires to little more than, in another memorable image of Nietzsche's, the green pasture happiness of the herd. All of this taps into, as well, Christian imagery about the Lord being our shepherd, our being lost sheep, and so on. It also suggests that we're too easily influenced or led, in this case, as Nietzsche spells out in the third essay of the genealogy especially, by priestly machinations. Nietzsche, in employing this imagery, suggests a number of things about Christianity and Judeo-Christian morality. So let me give one more example of an animal image, and then I'll draw to a close. Complaining about the decadence of modern culture, Nietzsche describes the maggot man, Gewürm, as teeming in the foreground. We might interpret this as simply an attempt to incite disgust and repulsion. But I think there's more going on here, a partial truth that Nietzsche is trying to bring out, and we can unpack if we're closely attentive to the kinds of imagery he's using. Maggots, the little worms that crawl into your food, they're attracted by what's decaying and decomposing. But they're also creatures whose presence furthers the decay and decomposition. So I think Nietzsche's not just trying to revolt us with the image, but he's actually suggesting something about the relationship between a certain kind of person and a certain kind of culture. Trying to suggest something similar about human beings. They're attracted by and feed off of decadent societies, values, and ideals, and their presence further entrenches this kind of decadence. Now, vastly more to be said about Nietzsche's imagery than could possibly be covered here. But what I've tried to impart through these cursory case studies is that his imagery isn't just about manipulating our emotions, though that's something it very often does. It's also about trying to disclose truths. So just to conclude very briefly, analytical work on Nietzsche has tended to downplay questions relating to why Nietzsche writes in the way that he does, and in particular, what philosophical significance his way of writing has. It's focused much more on trying to build up doctrine instead. But what I've explored in a preliminary way in this paper is that Nietzsche's unusual ways of approaching philosophy, they're of considerable philosophical interest and importance too. Behind these methods of writing, we see important methodological commitments for how philosophy might be conducted and for how philosophical truth can be conveyed. Although I've presented a Nietzsche who's not dubious about truth, he is one who's dubious about the methods of traditional philosophy. He, of course, does harbor serious doubts about the ultimate value of truth, but not, I think, about the possibility of finding it. The representational medium of philosophy, for him, indeed presents truths about the world, but we need to be open-minded in thinking about the ways that it can do this. Thank you.